And a very good morning to you. We're live from London. You're with Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Welcome. Coming up, my guests, David Schlesinger and Terry Stiastny, will share their views on the week's biggest stories. Good morning to you both. Terry, we'll start with you. What have you spotted?
Well, I think we're going to talk a lot about the week of chaos that we've just had here in the UK with a big government reshuffle, and a week of chaos coming up in France where the government is expected to collapse and some French people are talking about stopping doing everything for a day.
You've got your political bit between your teeth there. We'll also be heading to Istanbul for the latest news from the region.
I'm Hannah Lucinda Smith in Istanbul, and coming up later I'll be talking about the growing wind energy industry in the Aegean and a robotic lifeguard that's been rolled out in the Turkish resort of Antalya.
Plus, Monocle's editorial director Tyler Brûlé will be joining us post-Quality of Life conference from Palma in Mallorca. It's the 7th of September 2025. Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
And a very good morning to you, David and Terry. Thank you for coming in, sparing your Sunday. Nice to see you. How's your week been, Terry?
It's been a very busy week, actually. It's felt really like, back to school, back to work in earnest. This week Parliament was back in the UK and there's been a lot of political shenanigans, as we'll probably talk about later. But also, getting kids back to school, doing book events, doing podcasts and sort of quite busy, which is good.
Which is excellent. How about you, David? Have you come out of the rocket launcher at the same speed as Terry?
Well, I feel quite off-brand today because I've worked on my quality of life by being at home, by being in parks, by not buying anything, by not traveling, by not going to expensive restaurants. So I'm very off-Monocle brand today.
Oh, I don't know. That sounds like a perfectly lovely thing to do. And do you feel happier, healthier, wiser and richer for it?
I think I have a pretty decent quality of life today.
He has a lovely quality. He's a local around here, and we see him and his incredibly wonderful wife just going for lovely walks around Marylebone every single day. If there's anybody who does actually know how to enjoy their neighbourhood and how to make the most of a very nice place to live, I think it's arguably you, David. There's no tearing around.
Well, thank you very much. I'll take that.
Okay, good. Let's head to Palma, Mallorca. Good morning, Tyler. Are you enjoying the afterglow of our Quality of Life conference? We're joining by our editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, who's day after the day before.
Buenos dias. Good morning, Emma. Indeed. I'm actually on the MA13 highway hurtling northwards out of Palma. I've just said goodbye to a whole group of Monocle patrons. Our editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, is about to take them on a bit of an architecture tour in and around Palma, taking in some galleries, etc. So they're off doing that. I'm going to rejoin the family in progress up in Formentor, up in the very, very north of the island.
Okay, lovely. And how was it? So we have to sort of wind back a couple of days, if that's all right, if that is at all possible, and take us through what happened from Thursday evening onwards, please, in Barcelona.
Well, this was the 10th edition of our Quality of Life conference. It was, as ever, these things kick off on a Thursday evening. People flew in from all over the world. It was a record number of delegates, Emma, so it was by far our biggest conference and just an amazing gathering. Biggest group came from the United States, as is often the case. So, and that's West Coast. It's Florida. It's New York. Second biggest group was from the UK. Third biggest from Spain, actually. I mean, oftentimes, it's great when you're in someone's country, but sometimes they don't make up one of the bigger delegate groups. And Spain is an important market for us, but it's not a huge market for Monocle. So it was just great to see a real show of force from Spain. So Thursday evening at the Miro Foundation, wonderful, wonderful reception, a dinner for, all of the speakers. We were probably about 27, 28 speakers, plus all of the Monocle hosts. So that was a dinner for around 50 people on the rooftop of the Miro Foundation. Only the third time it had ever happened. Magical, amazing weather. And then Friday just kicked off with a very, very pacey conference and really sort of mixed it up. And this was one of the interesting things, and this is a bit of your sort of afterglow comment, Emma. A lot of people said, you're not running a conference. They said you're running a retreat. So I would say take that as really high praise, because people said it is so nourishing and all enveloping, and a conference sort of, you think sort of lanyards, and and lots of stand-up tables. And I think we're sort of rather the opposite of that. And it was a really, really fantastic day. It was just a different array of, I would say, staging and scenography, and everybody just, very, very on board for a variety of discussions which spanned, of course, everything from where is the world going from a geopolitical perspective to the future of aging. Why are the Spanish doing it better? Why are the Spanish number 2 after Japan when it comes to longevity? And then unpacking so many things in between. And
it's the tiny things that you focus on at the Quality of Life conference, which always opens up a much bigger debate. I mean, when you talk about the ethics and the strengths of good hospitality, it's always good to talk to someone who knows how to do uniforms really well, because that sort of can give you that tiny little example of if you have a crisply dressed team of staff, then it starts, the chances are that your hotel or your restaurant is going to be of a similar standard.
Exactly. And I have to say the Spanish do good uniforms. And that was, we had a wonderful pair of women. They have a company, Vestida for Work, based in Barcelona. And check them out. I mean, they just do really, really amazing designs. And this is one of the things we said, isn't it one of those strange things, and maybe many of our listeners who are wrapping up their holidays or will be checking into a hotel later today or a restaurant. We're in that era right now where need
Tyler, I think
the same.
I fear.
Emma, can you hear me?
I fear that the M13 is beating us. Carry on. If we lose you, Tyler, huge apologies. But let's have another go, and we'll keep going until it fails.
Okay. Yeah, I think as you get out of Palma, Emma, it does start to drift. The thing. I'm just going to say that is the amazing thing. When you have a great uniform, people are proud, and also you distinguish them from the guests. And that was part of a whole series of rethinks that we did across the day as well. So just rethinking different sectors. And that was really a key moment. And also, at shorter intervals as well, 10, 12 minutes rather than everything sort of being 25 or 30 minutes.
Okay, and that's important, isn't it? That if you keep the pace going, then actually people do feel there's less chance that people are going to start looking at their phones.
Exactly. And well, listen, anyway, we were in, I don't know how thick the walls were, but at Palau de Musica, the walls were probably 3 meters thick, so it didn't even matter. You couldn't look at your phone anyway. We did have, of course, Wi-Fi, but everyone was just in it. And of course, the day ended, and as we've commented, we had a group of Castelleros come in. This is the tradition of making a Catalan human tower. And we had 80 people come into the auditorium, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Everybody burst into tears watching people from 80 through to 65 to 5 years old create this tower in the span of really a couple of minutes. And that was really literally the high point in the wrap for the day.
And you talk in your column about the fact that when you see intergenerational working like that, you actually see trust in action.
Exactly. I mean, as Andrew said, it's like literally people have your back, and that is this amazing thing, this passing on of knowledge, this idea of community trust, and also just physical activity as well, and accomplishment. But also was one of the amazing things which one of the gentlemen said. He said his mother was always so scared of him taking his kids to this club and getting them to climb on top of people. And he said, more kids, are injured going to school and playing football than actually climbing atop other people and being 12, 13 meters above the ground. With no nets and wires, I might add.
No, you never need nets and wires. That's for cheaters. You talked about physical activity there, so we must indeed ask you about what happened in the evening.
Well, we ended up after a wonderful evening at La Paloma, an incredible restaurant, former nightclub. We went to our own nightclub, the Bluesman Bar at the El Palace, and we had DJ Pitch. You know him very well, Emma, our DJ from Zurich. He flew in, and it was a full dance floor till 4 a.m. And then people had to, of course, be up again and out doing tours.
Excellent. And that is how it should be. Tyler, we're going to let you go because I don't think the M13 is going to let us talk for very much longer. Thank you so much for joining us on the line from Parma. And also the warmest of thanks for talking us through the Quality of Life conference. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson, David Schlesinger, independent advisor and commentator on media, journalism and China, and Terry Stiastny, author and political journalist, are my guests this morning. A very good morning to you once again. David, you were listening to Tyler talking about the importance of good uniform, which sort of sparked your attention because you really want to talk about what happened in China this week and the importance of uniform.
No, I think the point that you made and Tyler made was a very good one, that sometimes having a good uniform, being coordinated, having everything click correctly makes a big difference for morale. And this week, Xi Jinping in China put on a big parade, a really big parade. His first one in about 5 years. He had important guests. He had Putin. He had North Korea. It was really a very big show, but everything was well coordinated. He showed off a nuclear triad, nuclear missiles that are capable of going from land, underwater, from the air. He showed off cyber weapons, showed off anti-drone weapons, and everything worked perfectly. And this was a real contrast to the rather lackadaisical parade that Donald Trump put on in Washington a while back. Trump really wanted to have a parade. Trump, I think, would love to be Xi and to command such respect and such order. But he couldn't do it. And in the United States, you saw sort of soldiers sort of sauntering and slumping, and there was no coordination. But Xi showed that he was in command of a PLA that was modernized and, importantly, also domestically built up. In contrast to the last parade and the one before that, when a lot of the weapons were from Russia, old Soviet Union, remodeled from them. The technology was bought in from Israel, for example. But this year, estimates are 85-90% was purely domestically made.
Just staying with you for the moment, David, you mentioned the fact that you immediately compared and contrast with Donald Trump. Clearly, this is something that is being done in Beijing very, very deliberately. And the idea was, to whom was this message addressed or this show addressed? Domestically, yes, to say, look at us, we have, we can protect you. China is strong internally, and there is, one strong message to Chinese people. But also, to how much is a parade like this directed at the United States completely? I mean, given the fact that I think there's often that idea that China quite likes to insert itself an awful lot into the Second World War, which is quite an unusual sort of approach.
Well, I think this is really showing the entire global South that there is a counterweight to the U.S. Who really are the allies of the U.S. at the moment? Trump has managed to offend just about everyone. Even the traditional allies who maintain an alliance, like Europe, feel rather uneasy and haven't been treated particularly well. And China's saying, look, we can be friends with India, we can be friends with Russia, we can be friends with Pakistan at the same time. North Korea, you all can look to us as a counterweight to what is the craziness that is going on in Washington.
And that sends a very powerful message to absolutely everybody else, doesn't it? David doesn't just mention the global south there, but it sends a message to Europe, because when you have Vladimir Putin cozying up with the North Korean and the Chinese leaders, that is a message to Europe as much as saying, we have everybody but you.
Yes, it's interesting.
We're against you.
I think, having parades like this, it feels to me so sort of 20th century. If you're talking about the Second World War, it feels like something that comes from a slightly different era. And I think maybe we thought for a few years that we'd gone past this sort of, Kremlinology of having to look at how many weapons people were, marching past in their parade and who's standing where on the podium to try and work out what was going on. But yes, I think, this, if it is a realignment that can kind of overcome all the obvious political differences, say, between India and China or India and Russia, for instance. I mean, it was interesting that Narendra Modi was there as well. We had a lot of other world leaders from sort of, Central Asia, from the Middle East. This was quite a big meeting, to say, the US is not the only game in town. We can work together, and caveats that has always been difficult in the past. That is quite a big shift. And I think, Europe in particular, NATO should be pretty concerned about it.
Indeed. And how correct is Terry in that assumption that we're now going back to a 20th century way of thinking? It feels very much that way.
Well, I think the old-fashioned criminology definitely has its place. If you think back to the last parade that Xi put on, he had his two predecessors standing next to him. This time, he had Putin and Kim. So that's a very strong message, not only to the world, but also domestically, that I'm in charge. I don't owe anything to anybody. I am the man, and my priority is to build alliances outside. The iconography, the terminology of the weapons, I think is very important to show. Of course, we don't know if they actually work, but to highlight this nuclear triad, to highlight the cyber weapons, to highlight the drones, to highlight the robotic wolves. That shows a very modern army. And I think people should pay attention to that.
I mentioned the fact that the Europeans weren't there. They were. The Hungarian foreign minister was there, and the Slovak prime minister, Robert Fico, were both there as well. That, again, says we have got everybody now, doesn't it? That complete dominance of an attempt to dominate the narrative now must make Washington feel how, or must make Brussels feel how.
Well, yes, and I think having Turkey there as well, that's an interesting. It's a lot of people saying, well, we're just there to go and see what's going on. We're just sort of observing this. But yeah, you do want to. Although some of the rhetoric that was coming out of it was saying we want to rely on international organisations, we believe in the UN, we believe in international trade bodies, and we do believe in doing things through sort of that established, post-Second World War order, if you like. You think, well, to what ends? And are they going to be trying to use those bodies as well to shift things in favour of, other countries which are not the United States, as at the same time that the US is withdrawing from those to a certain extent?
Sorry, go ahead.
I think that you just made a very important point, that China is now the one talking about international organizations and international rules and norms, at the same time that the U.S. is violating them. This was the week that the U.S. blew up a Venezuelan boat just for the heck of it, and also the week that the New York Times broke the story that in Trump's first term, the U.S. had tried to put a listening device in North Korea, and it failed, but in the process killed some North Korean civilians. These are not normal international rules. These are not the way a democratic country in the old days behaved. And so China is now the one talking about international organizations, rules and norms. And the U.S. is saying, well, we violate them when we please.
Tell us a little bit more about this New York Times article. It was an astonishing story, wasn't it?
You'd think that it was something off Slow Horses or some spy story that someone has just made up. But basically, in Trump's first term, at the same time that he was trying to negotiate with North Korea over its nuclear program, he decided he really needed to listen in on it. And so he tasked Navy SEALs to go put a sophisticated listening device on the beach and use that for communications. But they had to go in basically blind, and they failed. They thought that they'd done all the spying they needed to do, and they'd be alone when they did this. But in fact, they picked up that there was a fishing boat there, and they had to abort the mission, and they took what they considered to be the appropriate action to kill everybody on that boat to try to escape. And so they totally failed. And of course, the negotiations on the nuclear program broke down as well. So it was this has been kept secret until now, 2019, until today. But I think it just shows how, A, aggressive Trump is willing to be, but B, how actually constrained the U.S. is in dealing with countries like North Korea, like Iran. It can talk big, but it can't always take the action it wants to take.
And tell us a little bit more about the wider context of action like this, and what kind of message it sends, and especially what kind of message it sends when it goes wrong.
Well, I think that's the fascinating thing. This is exactly, it's like something from Slow Horses or James Bond, but goes wrong. it's interesting that obviously North Korea either didn't know what had happened. Well, there were 6, I think, civilian fishermen who were killed and whose bodies were somehow sunk to the bottom. So, what did the authorities there do when they realised that 6 people had gone missing in a boat? Because presumably, if they'd thought this is some kind of enemy action, they could either have escalated it massively. If they said, the Americans are invading us, it could have been a huge, huge international incident. But maybe did they know, or did they decide that, we didn't want to look vulnerable, we didn't want to look as though the Americans came right up to our coast and killed our fishermen, and so they decided not to tell everybody about it. But you just think that's such a dangerous game to be playing, because if you are found out, if you are caught, the risks of that escalating are absolutely massive. And
yes, just as an interesting thought experiment, imagine North Korean or Chinese trying to do something off the coast of Hawaii or off the coast of Massachusetts and killing lobster fishermen off the coast of Massachusetts. You couldn't imagine how the U.S. would react, or you could imagine, but it would be about as huge an escalation as you could possibly.
There's actually, I've just been rewatching a great Powell and Pressburger film from the Second World War where exactly that happens. Germans on a submarine land on the coast of Canada and go around killing people and trying to escape and get into America. So that kind of was the premise for a film, during the Second World War.
What's interesting about it is it seems to go, as you said, we're going back to 20th century espionage again. Yeah. Which is in a major contrast to the way that we now assume that monitoring is done, which is through cyber attack, and indeed when people send enormous balloons over each other's countries as well, which is what happened a couple of years ago. And the idea that people are still sitting in a room somewhere and plotting to plant something on a beach in North Korea, I think that for me was the big surprise.
Well, I think it just shows how desperate the U.S. is to find out what it really is happening there. Nobody understands North Korea. Not even the Chinese understand North Korea very well, even though Kim made one of his very, very rare visits to China last week. This was, I think, his 4th visit, or the first in several years. He brought his daughter, which is an interesting bit of criminology there too as well. Is she now the designated successor or not? But
she's a respected child, which I think it was the word which basically sends wants to say respected, then that's it. She's signed up.
Well, I always wanted to be a respected child as well. I'm not sure I succeeded, but that was always a goal.
We look forward to your departure to Pyongyang in the imminent future then. Let's talk a little bit more about this idea of going back to the United States and the message that this week's parade conveys. There's a really good article in the Sunday Times today which says how China could take control of Taiwan without a shot being fired. It says President Xi's military parade last week was designed to intimidate the island and to reinforce the US view that it is not worth going into war in its defence. I mean, Terry, that's that interesting thing that you mentioned a moment ago, that in a moment when the United States' star is fading, we don't know how long for, the idea that they're capitalising on the US, on Donald Trump not being bothered with another war is a phenomenal one, isn't it? Because, when you have Taiwan at stake here, it sort of shows you where orders of priorities are.
Yeah, and it's strange, given the sort of there's such a difference between what the Trump administration sort of says it's doing. I mean, this is the week where they decided to change the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War, but at the same time seem, very reluctant to the idea that it might get into other wars. So, on one level, it's this sort of rhetoric of, we're fighting wars, we're not just defending ourselves. And on the other level, you think, well, are you really doing that? Are you really engaging in the way that you need to try to defend rather than to necessarily fight?
And where does that leave China, David, given the idea that until now the United States is still much, much far ahead in terms of being the world's biggest military power? But when you have this show of power from China, and then you have this fear that actually the United States is on the retreat, how powerful is China and its military at the moment? I mean, just generally speaking, we saw it looking powerful this week, but what's the fact behind it?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's certainly large. and we know it's large. We know it's well financed, not as well financed as the U.S., but it hasn't been tested in battle for many, many years. Number one. Number two, Xi Jinping has purged a lot of the leadership in recent years. The ostensible reason was corruption, and I'm sure there was a lot of corruption at a time that you're building up your defenses in such a way. But I'm sure a lot of it was not just corruption, and it was about power and showing who is in charge and showing that the party is very much in charge of the military. And that must have taken a toll on morale. You can't lose half your top generals and not have it have an effect. So I don't really know how the PLA would act in anger. But that said, China, with the exception of Taiwan and the islands in the South China Sea, China really has not had an aggressive posture towards anybody. It's had border skirmishes, of course, with India, and that's a big thing. It's had border skirmishes with Russia, which have been calm. It had an issue in Vietnam several decades ago. But in general, China has had a defensive posture than an offensive posture, which is interesting when you talk about Trump changing the name from the Department of Defense to the Department of War, what his posture really is. But China has not threatened Japan or Korea or Thailand with takeover. That's just not in the Chinese strategy.
And nor does it want to get directly engaged in a hot war with the United States. No. It is absolutely not in its interest. And it goes back to the narrative about posture rather than actual genuine threat, doesn't it, Terry?
Yes, it does. I mean, that's, I guess you want to show, China, I suppose really wants to exert its power economically, primarily. Yes. I mean, that is what is in China's interest at the moment is, financial economic success, buying into, investing in other countries, having funds that are going in, big companies that are going in and getting quite sort of enmeshed in the world economy. And you might want to be able to build lots of military equipment and have the economic power to do that. But also, I don't think, they want to threaten their own standards of living or their own position in the world economy by getting into a war, getting into a situation such as Russia is, where you're facing lots of economic sanctions.
The time here in London is 9:27 a.m. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson, joined around the studio table by David Schlesinger, independent advisor and commentator on media, journalism and China, and by Terry Stiastny, author and political journalist. Let us head to Istanbul now for the latest news. Hannah Lucinda-Smith is Monocle's correspondent in the region. A very good morning to you, Hannah.
Good morning.
How are things where you are?
Well, it is the end of summer. We can feel the Turkish resorts kind of emptying out, the weather dropping. It's a kind of it's a weird feeling here in Turkey because on the one hand, summer's the season where everybody's going and having fun. On the other hand, when you're in Istanbul, it's not too pleasant in the height of summer. So there's a sort of sense of relief when the summer temperatures start dropping.
Is there actually a sense of relief when the tourism industry starts to wind down as well? Because no country would ever admit that it quite likes it when everyone goes home.
Yeah, I really think it depends on who you talk to. I do remember the pandemic, and this is fairly awful to say, so please excuse me, but there was, when there were no tourists, there's something very magical about sort of wandering around like a city on Istanbul pretty much on your own. And of course, when places are very, very crowded, and there is a problem with over-tourism, which I think sort of stretches to everyone heading for the same places at the expense of others. There are plenty of places actually on the Turkish coast which are not crowded at all, if you know about them, and others which are just fully packed out. So I think there is a sense of relief for those of us who don't rely on tourism for our incomes. I think, for those who do, then, any tourists are good news. And
then the narrative switches to the autumnal subjects, and tourism stops being the great thing, but everybody goes back to talking about what they were doing before the tourists arrived. One thing you wanted to talk about, and you mentioned it at the top of the programme, was wind farming.
Yeah, wind farming. So this might not be something that you necessarily connect with Turkey, but there's something of a wind tunnel along the Aegean corridor. That's the bit of sea that goes between Turkey and Greece, the sort of northern end of the Turkey's western coast. It's the kind of centre of the wind industry, and I was there a few weeks ago to see some of the wind farms around the city of Izmir and listen to a little bit more about the industry and plans that Turkey has to grow it. I think it's quite interesting, in contrast to Trump's America, where they're just slashing any kind of support for renewables, and that's really having a knock-on effect. In Europe, actually, renewables are still expanding. The problem here in Turkey and in other places in Europe is that you have this expansion of wind power and also of solar power, but what you don't have accompanying it is the domestic industry to manufacture the turbines and the hardware, solar panels and things like that to support it. So Turkey is importing almost all of that hardware. The hardware that it does produce, ironically, it's exporting to other places. And this is something that's kind of a Europe-wide problem. Increasingly, China is becoming the leading manufacturer of things like wind turbines. But really what Europe needs to do is to boost its own industry, because, of course, this isn't just about sort of, nice, green credentials. This is also about energy security.
Hannah, you will be delighted to hear that we've got David Schlesinger, who's in the studio, who is a China expert. So I'm going to put this point directly to David. Just tell me a little bit more, David, about the context of where China is expanding with all this kind of stuff, clearly happening in Turkey.
China has really majored on green investment, not just for itself, but for export. And it's solar panels, wind. The Chinese manufacturing is a huge global force.
And tell me, Hannah, I don't know, and David as well, the fact that there was a Turkish representative at this big parade earlier this week. Hannah, was that mentioned and picked up at all where you are?
Slightly. I mean, it's not the sort of thing that really plays well in Turkey. Ironically, Turks, let's say the Turkish mentality occupies this really sort of strange place where, they can both be hostile to the West, but also hostile to Russia and hostile to China as well. Turks sort of see themselves as a bit of an exception. So it wasn't something that was sort of promoted. And certainly there are a lot of Turks who are very, very unhappy about the way that Erdogan is sort of swiveling the country away from being a Western-facing country to being a more Eastern-facing country. But this isn't something that's come out of the blue. Turkey's had, dealings with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for quite a few years. And if you remember at the end of last year as well, Turkey was also talking about perhaps joining BRICS. So this is part of a sort of longer term, let's say, realignment of Turkey in the world under Erdogan.
I think for China, Turkey is very, very important politically because of Xinjiang. China's greatest fear is a greater Turkish empire reemerging, or some of the Uyghur separatists making peace, making alliance with Turkey and other Turkic peoples. And so it wants very much to keep Turkey and Erdogan on side. The idea that the Uyghurs are terrorists, you don't like terrorists either. It's not that they're a Turkic people, they're Turkic terrorists, so they're bad. And it's very important for China to have that kind of message made again and again and again.
And how much, Hannah, does President Erdogan make sure that idea is not necessarily just exploited, but battered to death?
Yeah, so I mean, this is something that does play well in Turkey. This idea, as you're saying, of a sort of greater Turkic nation that stretches all the way from Xinjiang to places in Europe. What's really interesting is that there was some point where Erdogan was really sort of trying to, present himself as a backer of the Uyghur, as he does, backer of the Palestinians, other people. And quickly he found that was going to come with some serious economic disadvantages, because obviously, China is not happy when you do things like that. And he's gone very quiet on that. And actually, over the past few years, when I've been talking to Uyghur exiles here, they're increasingly worried actually that Turkey might be cooperating with China to extradite them, send them back, arrest them. So I think there's always this tension here in Turkey between, what plays well with the public and actually what Erdogan needs economically.
Let's move on to another story that you wanted to tell us about, Hannah, which sort of is slightly aligned in terms of Turkey's international expansion. And you wanted to talk about a new railway.
Yeah, so this is a railway that's going to go from the city of Kars in the very east of Turkey, right on the Armenian border, to a place called Nakhchivan, which you might not have heard of. I won't blame you if you haven't. Nakhchivan is an exclave of Azerbaijan, so it's not attached to Azerbaijan itself. It's very, very close now, but it does sit on the Turkish border. So at the moment, there is no land border directly between Turkey and Azerbaijan. That could change with this railway line. As you might remember, Azerbaijan seized the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia between 2020 and 2023. That's left just a very, very small corridor of territory, of Armenian territory, separating Azerbaijan from Nakhchivan and therefore from Turkey. And in the peace deal that was done last month, you might remember, with Donald Trump overseeing that, part of the aim of that for Azerbaijan is to make sure that it can start forging these new transport links westwards to Turkey, creating this very, very direct link between Baku and Kars. And that's what's been started with this railway.
How important is it for Azerbaijan to forge deeper relations with Turkey?
I mean, the relations are already deep, and they're based on more than politics. They're based on language, they're based on religion, they're based on culture. You know, as Turkey... I wonder what Azerbaijan thinks of this, but Turkey sort of sees Azerbaijan as sort of a little brother state. They say two states, one nation. So that's always been the case. But increasingly, yeah, I think what's important for Azerbaijan is Turkey's growing influence in the South Caucasus overall. And that's an influence that's come at the expense of Russia, which is sort of losing its influence there. And I think these kind of rail links are something that are really kind of embedding Turkey's influence in the region for decades to come.
Indeed. And just talking about what it's like for the Turkish perspective, from ordinary Turks' perspectives, that to see this breaking, you know, this construction of a railway and this political influence is one thing, but what about economic and cultural influence? You said, you know, they're close already. Is there a sense of excitement in Turkey that this is happening?
I wouldn't say excitement. I mean, I think, again, certainly, you know, the sort of public feeling overwhelmingly in Turkey is, of course, in favour of Azerbaijan. And I think, you know, anything that's going to help the Turkish economy, of course, is going to play well. But I think, you know, really, it's going to be really, really helpful for the Azerbaijani economy more than that. The rail link between Azerbaijan and Turkey up till now is something I wrote about for Monocle a couple of years ago. Took this huge loop, you know, to cut out Armenia. It went through Georgia and looped around and then went to Kars. And if you look on a map, this new route is just direct. So I think it's really going to, you know, turn Azerbaijan from a place that was quite isolated in the South Caucasus into a real centre of logistics links between actually Europe and China. That's where it sits.
Finally, let's talk. I mean, we began talking about the end of the summer season, but there's a story that's sort of hanging over from Turkish tourism season, and it's to do with robots.
Yeah, so one for next summer season. It's just been brought in at the end of this one. This is a robot called Fasti. It's been developed by a robotics company in Antalya, and it's a robotic lifeguard. It basically looks a little bit like, can you remember when you're learning to swim, when you're very small and you kind of hold onto a float at first, right? And then you sort of kick your legs. It looks a bit like that, but a motorized version, and it's remote controlled. And the idea is if somebody's in trouble in the sea, very, very quickly, lifeguards can use this remote control and send it out, and somebody can grab onto it. So obviously, you know, the multiple benefits of that. It's faster, and also you're not putting somebody else's life at risk. You know, you're not having other people diving in. So it's been rolled out already in the public beaches and also in hotel beaches just in the last couple of weeks in Antalya. And I think, you know, next year when you come for your summer holidays in Turkey, you can expect to see it in a lot of places.
How excited are people about this? Again, the fact that heaven forbid that anyone should find themselves in trouble at sea, but it's always quite nice to have a sort of a human face to come and stick an arm out. To have Fasti come over and it basically a large remote control tug. Does that actually, are people inspired by this? Do people actually genuinely feel reassured?
One thing I will say about Turks is that they're very enthusiastic early adopters, you know, and actually the tech industry here, particularly in certain sectors, is very, very good. And I think Turks are very, very proud of new innovations and seeing these kind of, new inventions coming out of Turkey. So I think there will be some enthusiasm and excitement about it, yeah.
Hannah Lucinda Smith, gearing up for the for next year's summer season in Turkey. Thank you so much for joining us on the line from Istanbul. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday. Terry Stiastny, give us a story that you've spotted this week.
Yeah,
I think internationally, but I think you wanted to dive deep into British politics.
I would just love to be a fly on the wall and listen into the conversations between Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron coming up this week, which were probably along the lines of, you think you've got problems? Well, listen, mate, this is how it's going. So in looking at the UK, obviously all the Sunday papers are talking about the government reshuffle. So basically sort of new listeners start here. The Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, had to resign at Friday lunchtime because she was found to have underpaid her taxes on buying a house. But interestingly, government reshuffles are often very chaotic in the UK. People don't want to be moved, they don't want to be fired. But this seemed like something that had been a long time in the planning because new ministers, big ministerial jobs, so Foreign Office, Home Office, Justice Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister, all rearranged very quickly. And according to the Telegraph this morning, one of the reasons they were able to do this so smoothly is not just politics, it's technology. Apparently they've designed a big touchscreen whiteboard for reshuffles. Now, traditionally, this has been done in a British amateurish fashion, literally names stuck on a whiteboard and written out, and they're going, oh, well, if she's moving there, we need to move him over here. And apparently they can now drag them with their finger and sort of say, right, David Lammy is going to become Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister, and then they can see where else they need to move people. And they can also look at the gender balance. That's actually one of the interesting things about this reshuffle. It means that apart from the Prime Minister, for the first time in the UK, we have all the main great offices of state held by women. So the Chancellor, the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, which is pretty unusual. And so they work out exactly. So they seem to have been. It's quite interesting. People always talk about the Downing Street operation and how you are running a modern government out of a sort of, I can't remember what century, a 19th century, 18th century townhouse in the middle of London. It's not really designed for it. And one of the things people have always said is we need to get the tech working. We need to have more efficient systems. And it does seem in this one small area, at least, they seem to have done that.
I think what's interesting about the whole thing is that they have this reshuffle, and you talked about the tech and the modernisation. But in fact, we all went back to school on Monday, and so did Parliament. And guess what? By the end, you had a very similar and traditional early, start of season story. Government comes out saying it's going to be different and great, and by Friday they've lost one of their key players. And I wonder how excited or thrilled people were about this sort of return to form as everybody went back from the holidays.
Yes, I think it's interesting because, as you say, they tried to rejig just the Downing Street operation on Monday, and by Friday they'd had to go all out and completely reshuffle the government. And interestingly, the other thing that was the sort of the noises off, if you like, at the time was the Reform Party conference in Birmingham, where you had Nigel Farage, who had to pull his speech forward by about 3 hours because he realised that the news was all running about Angela Rayner and the government reshuffle and not Nigel Farage and his sort of attendants and people doing weird songs and things like that. So they are trying to now take the fight to Reform, who, although they are a party with 4 or 5 MPs currently, are polling very well in the polls, and particularly on issues like immigration. They feel that, Reform are making the running on that. And that is, interestingly, where the fight is, not the straight Labour Conservative fight that you would expect.
Were you excited by the scandals in the British political world this week?
I'm still,
David?
I am actually still charmed and cheered that there's a norm that people resign when they've done something bad. When I look at the US and you see now corruption from top to bottom in government and nobody cares and people grow thicker skins by the minute, to still have a political system where the thing to do is to resign when you're caught out, I love it.
And actually it's quite funny. That suddenly made me think of what British politics was like 5 years ago under the Boris Johnson era, where actually there was a sense that it turned away from any allegations of misdemeanours. And so I wonder whether we are actually, whether David does have a very good point here, we are actually underestimating the solid and traditional and valuable nature of a British way of doing things.
Yeah, but it's interesting that when Boris Johnson ultimately had to go, it was actually because he didn't act quickly to get rid of somebody who had misbehaved. And the way that the MPs eventually got him to go was by resigning en masse. It was sort of like minister after minister, dozens and dozens of them on one morning until effectively the Prime Minister had gone as well. So, the power of a well-timed resignation is still quite a thing.
And looking at France, let's turn our attention to that. A vote of confidence to be held into the Prime Minister. He called it himself. And I think we would have had, it's either 4 or 5 Prime Ministers in the last 3 years as a result if Bayrou goes.
Yes, I mean, I do wonder why pre-announce your vote of confidence for 2 or 3 weeks hence, thereby giving all of your opposition the chance to work out all the particular sort of permutations and combinations by ways that they can unite to get you out. I mean, this is, the sign of a big political problem for Emmanuel Macron. They want to try and bring down the budget deficit. They want to try and make cuts. But, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is you're going to have this political chaos in France next week, and a lot of people are trying to capitalise on that. A lot of interesting articles here in the papers here in the Guardian and in the Times this weekend about the bloc en tout movement, which is an idea that the French people should just stop doing everything on Wednesday. But it's particularly things like don't spend money on your debit cards, take out cash, don't go to big shops. So really trying to kind of go back to a different model of the economy. I mean, yes, you can say in France, pretty much every autumn, there is some kind of protest. Of course, we had the Gilets jaunes, and then there's these new movements. So you might see people stopping doing things. You might see people sort of blocking roads and railway stations and schools and so forth. That's got a great tradition in France, but this seems a bit less organised. And, it's interesting to see what is behind it. Why are people in France, where on the face of things doesn't look so bad, really? Why are they so unhappy that they are, again, might take to the streets?
I think that's a question that might have been asked before, David.
But it amazes me why an entrenched government facing a popularist threat would do things that are so unpopular. I mean, why, when you are facing a populist opponent, do you talk about cancelling days off, increasing a pension age? Yes, there are good economic reasons why you might have to do it. But to be deliberately unpopular at a time when your opponent is trying to be deliberately popular does not seem to be good politics to me.
Well, I'm not entirely sure whether there's much good politics going on there as well. I mean, the fact remains is that France faces this enormous deficit. But the idea of actually, not just reforming, working conditions and pensions, but to chop a couple of national days off.
Yes. Yeah, that is pretty much a thing that is guaranteed to be unpopular. I mean, yes, you can, as Boris is trying to do, make the economic case. Well, you don't need a day off. People don't spend money. We need to be more productive and all of that. But people are going to say, "What do you mean I've got to work an extra day?" But the French do have a lot of public holidays, and particularly with the idea of where you faire le pont. So if your public holiday falls on a Thursday, everyone's going to take Friday off as well. Pretty much that it's not going to be there. But they do have this tradition of action. So when I was in France over the summer, one of the pharmacists were really angry. And French pharmacists are brilliant. They can cure everything. They can tell you whether a mushroom is poisonous or not. They are sort of a fabulous institution. But they said, well, we're worried that the pharmacies aren't going to exist anymore. We're taking not only the public holiday off, but the Friday off and the Saturday off. And you can imagine the queues of the pharmacy on the Monday morning when they finally reopened, because they were saying, use us or lose us.
They may indeed change their plan once they realise how big the queue is on the Monday morning. They may regret those extra days. But I was thinking about this over the weekend, and the fact that France has got itself into a completely entrenched situation simply because of the way that Emmanuel Macron timed his dissolution of the Parliament. Because he did it in, June? It was on the night of the European parliamentary elections. He decided that he was going to go to the country because of this threat from Marine Le Pen and Marine Le Pen's party. But the fact remains that I always wonder that had he waited until after the Olympics, And when everybody loved France and everybody in France was happy for a moment, a glorious, blissful moment, had he done that, he would have encountered none of these problems now. But he managed to get himself into a load of trouble at the end of the summer term, which is when everybody's cross and wants to go home.
Yeah, I think, that's interesting as well. It's interesting about how you sell the message. I mean, Macron has obviously for a long time been saying France needs to modernise, we need to get with the modern... But you could have exactly used the Olympics to say, look, this is what France can do. We are brilliant. We have got the fastest swimmers. We can put on an amazing, let's be the best France in all the ways that we can. And then, as you say, sort of tried to carry that through into modernisation and maybe telling people that they needed to work a bit longer or, work a few more days a year.
Let's talk about some other stories. I think we need to cover a little bit of breaking news, if that's all right with you, David. It's not been confirmed yet, but we do have Reuters this morning reporting that the Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba is to resign to avoid a party split. And he has been embattled as well. His party has, his government has lost its majority in the parliament, and he stayed. He has convinced people that he would stay. He said he was going to resign, but then stayed. Japan had done really well in terms of negotiating a trade deal with the United States. Everything seemed fine, but now this is not good news for Japan.
I think when you look around the world, democracy is not doing so well anywhere. He's been in power only a year, I think, and already he's in trouble. Look, Japan has, there's economic stagnation, and I think people are fed up with it. They're fed up with it. Their living standards are not getting better. Yes, he negotiated a deal with the U.S., but are Japanese people really happy about having to import U.S. rice? I mean, rice is so important to the Japanese psyche, and now you have to take U.S. rice instead of your own rice. So I think there are a lot of things that might be fine at a policy level that then fall apart at the political level.
And there's also an interesting article in the Financial Times. I don't know if you've read it this morning, but it's called How Tokyo Became an Unexpected Haven for China's Middle Class. It says an aspirational generation of Chinese arrivals are beginning to shape Japan's demographic, social and perhaps even political destiny. Have you heard much about this? I mean, there are case studies about, one person who's been in Japan for a couple of years in a block that used to have one family and it now has 11 Chinese families in it.
Well, yeah, I was just in Tokyo when was it? In March, or I guess, and I was amazed by how many Chinese were there. And on every street corner, really, I could hear people speaking either Mandarin or Cantonese. Some of them tourists, but yes, some of them actually living there. I think we underestimate how close Japan really is to China, and it's become very easy. It's easier to go from Shanghai to Tokyo than it is to go from Shanghai to Hong Kong, even. And as the U.S. no longer is a desired destination. It's now a much harder destination to get to for Chinese. Japan is easy, it's close, it's advanced, it's comfortable. And there's a shared writing system in a way, so it's relatively easy to find your way around.
And yet there is this article is very good at saying it's a phenomenon either Japan or China failed to see coming. It says back in Shanghai and other big Chinese cities, dinner party conversations are now dominated by the mechanics of how to get to Tokyo or Osaka and stay there. Apparently, I'm quoting here from the FT, there's a code at dinners which signals a desire to turn a conversation to visas. And basically it is how long do you plan to stay? How noisy is that movement of departure now in China?
Well, interestingly enough, there's a Chinese character that is pronounced run, which doesn't mean run, but it sounds exactly like the English word run, which is talking about the idea that, yes, we should leave China. There is a fair amount of unhappiness among an elite on the one hand, but also some youth who have trouble finding work. So everyone's looking, where can I go to better myself? I think that's something that Xi Jinping has to deal with. He has to deal with youth unemployment, absolutely. He has to deal with the frustrations of the middle class who feel that their lives aren't getting better. But yeah, if you can run, you do.
Let's talk a little bit about Ukraine. This is some breaking news that's happened overnight, which is this targeting of government buildings in the centre of Kyiv. Terry, this is a huge departure now for Russia, isn't it? I mean, doesn't the Alaska summit seem like a very, very long
it does
time
seem
ago.
Extremely, yes. I mean, we've already had, in recent weeks, one, attack on Kiev, which hit the EU delegation office, the British Council office. This seems to be the main government building in Kiev, which has been hit for the first time. Sort of saying that Ukraine's Air Force reporting record numbers of drones and missiles in more than 800. So this is on a scale that we haven't seen for quite a while. And yes, the idea of that Russia could be persuaded to enter peace talks, and that you remember there was discussion about the sequencing of whether you have a ceasefire first or whether you start talking, and you can see precisely from the European and the Ukrainian point of view why you feel that you absolutely have to have a lasting ceasefire, because there clearly is none, and this clearly shows that this is not something that Russia is prepared to give up on at the moment.
Indeed, and as we're watching the news unfold, it looks like Ukraine's main government building is on fire. The roof has been damaged, and it's a sign that not necessarily just that Vladimir Putin is taking a new, more aggressive and direct approach, but actually that the Ukrainian air defense capabilities have not done their job successfully this time. But just talking about that idea about the desire for a ceasefire, and let's go back to where we started this program with the big parade in China when you had Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and, you had Narendra Modi, you had all the characters who would effectively say to the rest of the world, it does not matter if you are ready for a ceasefire because Russia has friends.
Right. And I think Russia probably doesn't want to be the little brother in the relationship, but at the moment it's a convenient place to be. But if it eventually wins in Ukraine, then it will then be in a much stronger position vis-a-vis China as well. And you'll have this duality there at the top that is a very, very strong and dangerous counterweight to the Europe and the US.
Finally, we've got a couple of minutes to talk about what we're going to be doing for the rest of the weekend within the context of an article in the Sunday Times. Rise of the posh home bar, plus more trends to know now. We'll let you go and work out what your trends are later on. But the rise of the posh home bar, it has there's an interior designer couple, and they say they have created floor-to-ceiling installations with under-the-counter refrigerators and brass shelvings. One South London basement has been transformed into a speakeasy, complete with vintage sofas, side tables and mood lighting. That sounds like a lounge to me. This idea that are you an enthusiastic cocktail mixer at home, and do you require your own home bar?
Okay, I don't have a home bar, but what I do have is my own espresso corner. And in fact, when we had the apartment renovated, the designer looked at my predilections and talked to me and made sure that I have my own sink. I have a counter area for my fancy espresso maker, my fancy grinder. I have my fancy espresso cups. So I don't do bars, but I do espresso.
This is amazing, David. And we haven't been round because we were talking about what's precious to you when you do redesign things, but bear in mind, and forgive me if I say this, but you live in the centre of London and no one has 4 or 5 floors in which to have that empty nook.
Well, I don't need a whole floor. I just need a corner. I just need a corner.
It sounds like a big corner. How big a corner are we talking?
Let's just say that before I had my espresso corner, it was very difficult to cook in our kitchen because I don't use most of the counter space.
Okay, that's wonderful. He has his own sink, ladies and gentlemen. I've never met anyone who has their own sink before. Terry, are you going to suddenly confess that you have, I don't know, you're in shipbuilding?
No, at the moment, everything in our house is crammed into, a very small space. And our main problem at the moment is getting our oven fixed because we have a basement kitchen. It's very much a London problem. The cooker was too heavy. The old one's broken. The new one, the delivery company refused to carry it down the stairs or to remove the old one. So we're now sitting with an oven which doesn't work. And so, the idea of a home bar, I just want a functioning cooker at the moment is my main goal.
All right, if we're going to go there, my washing machine's broken. Anyway, Terry Stiastny, David Schlesinger, Hannah Lucinda-Smith and Tyler Brulé were my guests today. The warmest of thanks to all of them. And thanks too to the producers, Mariella Bevan and Desi Bandley. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sunday's back next week. But until then, enjoy the rest of the weekend. Terry and I are off to fit our domestic appliances. Actually, no, we're going to go to David's for a coffee. Goodbye. Thanks for listening.